All right, we'll now move up to the middle of the 300s, and what I'd like to talk about is Emperor Julian just for a little bit, and then the rise of really bishops in general in the middle late 300s and their power. But mostly I want to focus on is a bishop named Ambrose, who was a bishop of the Italian city of Milan. This is only going to be part one because Ambrose did quite a few things. So in the next lecture, I will talk about the rest of what Ambrose ended up doing. But let's look at Emperor Julian. So we've already looked at Constantine, and I'd mentioned he was a Christian. You have his three sons, Constantius the second, Constantine, and Constans. They were all Christian as well. Now you move up to Emperor Julian. Sometimes his title is Emperor Julian the Apostate, meaning the one who left Christianity. So Julian was brought up. He was fairly isolated when he was brought up. He was a cousin to Constantine's sons. And when Emperor Constantine died, his sons went on a killing spree of killing all the male relatives of Constantine to make sure that they didn't rise up and say that they should be emperors. Now, they ended up killing Julian's father, but they spared Julian because they figured he was too young. He was about 5 at that point. So they kept him isolated from the royal family, but they did make sure that he was highly educated. So he ended up becoming emperor. Sorry, the dates here are wrong. That should be 361 to 363, not 363. So 361 to 363. Emperor Constantius II in the late 350s was doing quite a bit of battle with the Persians on the Eastern Front. And he really needed someone he thought he could trust to help run the empire. So what he did was he recalled Julian. And Julian was a teenager and was totally inexperienced with working with troops. And he was sent to the western part of the Roman Empire. Turns out he was a great military person, and his troops really loved him. And in 361, the troops were recalled by Constantius II to come and help him fight with the Persians. And those troops on the western side of the empire did not want to go. So what they ended up doing is making Julian emperor. And Constantius II certainly didn't like that. He gathered up his army and started moving west to do battle with Julian. And on the way, Constantius II died. So that left Emperor Julian as the only ruler of the Roman Empire. So again, he ruled from 361 to 363. Now, Julian outwardly was a Christian, but as far as we can tell, inwardly he was not. He was a follower of the Roman religion. And when he became emperor, he tried to reverse all the Christianization of the empire that had been happening since the time of Constantine. So he did a couple different things to do this. As we've been talking about, there were lots of controversies between different forms of Christianity, especially Arianism and Nicene Christianity. What you normally would have is a battling bishop who, for some reason, was on the wrong side. He would be sent into exile, meaning he couldn't come back into his home city. Julian did something really interesting by recalling all of the exiled bishops. Now, what that meant is all these people who were exiled came back to their home cities and started fighting with the bishops who were put in their place. And of course, this is just what Julian wanted. We find Julian tearing down quite a bit of the churches. He also restarted the pagan priesthood. He allowed pagan priests to start sacrificing and essentially set it up in the same type of hierarchy as Christianity. And one thing he also did too, and this caused some controversy even within the pagan side, is that he said Christians could not teach because they would be teaching about Christianity as opposed to the classics. And we have some writings from pagan Romans who said they didn't like this because they figured that teachers didn't matter what their beliefs were, they could still teach. Now, probably good for the Christians, Julian did not live or rule very long. In 363, he went to the Eastern Front to fight with the Persians, and he was killed in battle. Now, after the time of Julian, nearly all the emperors of the Roman Empire were Christian, so you don't find another person like Emperor Julian. Okay, now we want to spend a little bit of time talking about Ambrose. So he was born in 340. He became Bishop of Milan in 374. Now, he came from a long family of governors in Italy, so they were very, very influential in the Roman government. And as far as we can tell, Ambrose was just following in the footsteps of his father when he became governor of northern Italy in 370. Now, Ambrose comes to power, and so here's another image of Ambrose painted in the Renaissance. Now, Ambrose came to power in terms of a bishop in a really interesting way. So the previous bishop, or I should say the current bishop of Milan, was a man named Auxentius. So he became bishop in 355 and died in 374. Now, he became bishop when the previous bishop, Dionysius, was a Catholic. And this Catholic bishop was sent into exile by Constantius II. Now, if you remember, Constantius II was an Arian. And so what Constantius II did is he exiled a Catholic bishop and then put Auxentius in his place, and he was an Arian. So for almost 20 years, the city of Milan was run by an Arian. Now, Auxentius dies in 374. Now, Ambrose it's hard to say if he was even a Christian when he became bishop in 374, but the popular story about him becoming bishop is that there were arguments in Milan about who was going to be the next bishop, whether it was going to be an Arian or whether it was going to be a Nicene. And people couldn't figure out. And Ambrose had to sort of keep the peace because he was the governor, so he had troops and everything. The story goes that as Ambrose was standing there, a little girl's voice could be heard, even though they couldn't find the little girl, saying, "Ambrose for bishop, Ambrose for bishop." And it was publicly acclaimed that he become bishop. So he was not even a priest. So within the first week of his bishopric, he was ordained priest and then became Bishop of Milan. And he became very powerful. So there's 5 episodes that I want to talk about. In this particular lecture, I'm only going to talk about the first 2. His role as an ambassador for the emperors, and then something called the Altar of Victory, which is a statue and an altar put up by the Romans. And this was held in the Senate. And there was a big controversy over whether to have this statue and altar left in the Senate when you've got a Christian senators. And then this is a a complicated list of emperors. Now, you don't have to memorize all these. The people we're really going to be talking about are Gratian, just very briefly, Emperor Gratian of the West. I'll mention the usurper Maximus, and then I'll talk mostly about Valentinian II in this lecture, as well as Emperor Theodosius. Now, this date should be, it looks like I cut off the slide. 379, he ruled to 395. So those are the bishops we'll be the emperors we'll be talking about. Now, Gratian was a Catholic. His brother Valentinian was an Arian, as well as his mother. And then I've mentioned here Justina, who was the mother of Valentinian II. She was an Arian. Okay, and this is just a close-up of a coin of Valentinian II. And again, his mother Justina was an Arian. Okay, let's first talk about Ambrose as an ambassador. So I just showed you that list of emperors where you've got a man named Maximus in 383. He ended up doing battle with Emperor Gratian, and Emperor Gratian was killed. Now, Valentinian II became emperor in the West, and he was only 12 at the time, so he really didn't quite know what was going on. And you've got Emperor Theodosius, who was ruling in the East. When Valentinian II became emperor, he really started to rely on Bishop Ambrose for a number of different things, and one was to act as an ambassador between Valentinian II and the usurper Maximus. So essentially what you have in 383 are 2 emperors, the most valid one, which is Valentinian II, and Emperor Maximus, who was a usurper. So Ambrose went on the behalf of Valentinian II to meet with Maximus twice. So he met with him in 383 and 384. Ambrose, who was a prolific writer, and we have quite a few of his letters, sent a letter back to Valentinian II, and this is Ambrose's letter number 24, saying, "Such is the account of my mission." So what he ends up doing is telling about the mission he had with Maximus. At the end of his letter, he says, "Farewell," but then he gives a warning: "Be on your guard against a man who conceals war under the cloak of peace." What he's essentially telling is Maximus will probably invade Italy, so he wants Valentinian to be ready with that. Now, it turns out that Maximus did not invade until 387. So it's possible that Ambrose in his ambassadorship worked at least to prevent Maximus from invading earlier than this. Now, when he did invade, Valentinian II and his mother Justina fled to Theodosius. And they stayed with Theodosius. And Theodosius is the one who gathered up the troops in the east, invaded the west, and killed Maximus in 388. And I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here, but I do want to tell you that Valentinian II still is ruling the west, but he really has Theodosius ruling everything. Died in 392, and it's either a suicide or it was murder. We're not quite sure. But anyway, Ambrose was fairly successful as an ambassador, which is beyond his role as bishop. Okay, now I want to spend the rest of this lecture talking about the altar of victory. So the altar is the platform, victory is the statue that stands on it. Now, unfortunately, we don't know exactly what the altar of victory looked like in the Senate because the statue doesn't exist anymore, but we have plenty of statues of victory. And so she looks like an angel. So she's a woman with wings. So something like this statue was standing in the Senate. And it had a long history of standing in the Senate. We're not quite sure when the original was made. It was probably made around 200 BC. Very important to the Romans. Emperor Augustus, the first emperor, put it in the Senate in 31 BC. When you finally get down to the time of the Christian emperors, like Constantius II, they decide to remove the statue because it wasn't Christian. Julian, who we just talked about, he was trying to reverse the Christianization of the empire. He puts the statue altar of victory back in the Senate. It was once again removed by Gratian, and it was at this point during the time of Gratian that you've got a senator, a very famous senator named Symmachus, and he was a pagan or a Roman follower. He wanted the statue replaced. He wanted it put back into the Senate. And what he does is exchange a series of letters with both Emperor Valentinian II and with Ambrose. Ambrose, in this first letter that Symmachus sends to the emperor, Ambrose was told about this. And so what he does is he writes a letter to Valentinian II. And I will give you a link in our Blackboard site to all of these letters if you want to read the entire exchange. But in his letter 17 in chapter 12, he says, "Nothing is more important than religion, nothing more exalted than faith." Essentially what Ambrose is telling Valentinian II is religion is the most important thing above and beyond politics. So religion must come first. And essentially what he's saying is he doesn't want the statue of victory, or the altar of victory, put back in the Senate. Symmachus in 384 was put into one of the highest positions beside being emperor, and that was the prefect of Rome. And essentially that is a mayor. So what he ended up doing is sending another letter to Valentinian II, asking him to put the statue of victory, or the altar of victory, back into the Senate. And he also sort of bravely asked Emperor Valentinian II to reinstate some of the funding into the pagan temples. Now, probably what's happening here, Symmachus knows that Valentinian II is really a boy, and so he tried to influence him in that way. This work that he writes, a letter that he writes, is just called a memorial, and we've got these letters from Symmachus. Ambrose then writes his own letter to Valentinian II, and he threatens him with excommunication, which is essentially throwing him out of the church. And he says if he makes the decree to put the altar of victory back in the Senate, that it injures God, injures the memory of his father and his brother, and he says don't do it. That's essentially what Ambrose is saying. Ambrose also writes to Symmachus, and some scholars have written that Symmachus may have been a distant cousin to Ambrose. We're not quite sure, but Ambrose kind of puts Symmachus in his place and says that, you know, your gods are made out of stone, and gods are not worshipped out of stone. There's only one God, and that Symmachus is wrong. And in the end, Valentinian II refuses the request of Symmachus. So Symmachus then sends a letter to Emperor Theodosius, and Theodosius denies this as well. And more than likely, Ambrose had a hand in this as well, because we know that Ambrose and Theodosius definitely knew each other and were tied together. After the death or the murder of Valentinian II, you've got a usurper named Eugenius who takes over 392 to 394. he puts the altar of victory back in the Senate. And then you've got Emperor Theodosius coming to the rescue once again to the west. He kills Emperor Eugenius, and it's probably at this point when the altar of victory was removed from the Senate, and you don't really hear anything else about the altar of victory.